All right, so today we're going to talk about anti-racism training groups. And before we get started, I'm just going to give an outline of what we're going to be talking about. And so we're really focusing on training groups today as opposed to advocacy. And so a lot of the groups that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about a few different organizations. They do have advocacy within their system, so lobbying, dealing with legislation or litigation, anything like that. But we're going to be talking more about anti-racism training. So those are the groups that often come into workplace settings, education settings, business settings, multiple different settings to expand the conversation about racism and what role a person plays and how to deal with it and how to talk about it. So we're going to be focusing on that and the goals of those groups and what they're working towards and the efficiency of those groups and some of their strengths and weaknesses. And we also, as we're going through this, keeping in mind targeting mainstream white supremacy. So the past few weeks we've been talking about racist groups such as Aryan Nations or the Christian Identity Movement or the Ku Klux Klan. And so a lot of those are often tied to white supremacy in mainstream culture. But we're talking about mainstream white supremacy as in white privilege and our role in white supremacy. So the white supremacy where a lot of people say, I'm not a racist, but they're still a result of white privilege and that white supremacy. And then we're also, since we're talking about different groups and different organizations, there'll be brought up the ideas of different approaches for training and how different groups approach it and different strategies they use and the effects of those strategies. And we also want to talk about the idea of attacking institutional racism through educating individuals. There's a really powerful video later on that I think will really explain that idea of using individuals and educating individuals in order to attack that underlying layer of that iceberg that we've discussed at the beginning of class of institutional racism that's built in, that's really hard to see, really hard to define for a lot of people. And so as we're going through thinking about what role white people should play in anti-racism training and advocacy, and so if white people are obviously the ones within power, should white people be the ones directing and moving, or should we be relying heavily on people of color? So just looking at that, looking how that plays out. How do interpersonal and institutional approaches intermix when these groups are in training and discussing racism? And then also just formatting ideas that I think is really helpful for our future projects of what is the best way to approach anti-racism training. What do you guys see as being effective? What do you guys see as not being effective? What works well? What doesn't work well? And how can we take that and move forward with it in our own personal lives, but also in the context of this class. And then we're just going to play a short video. And so it's about a woman describing an experience that she had in a grocery store and how her sister-in-law, who is half African-American, half white, and she stood up and spoke out. And so we feel like a lot of these training groups are helping people recognize where they fall in this story. So I'll say a little bit more about it, but just kind of watch and think about the roles in this video.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together, raised our children together, so they're first cousins, and we, it's a wonderful, very multicultural family. So we're going to Safeway one day, and Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter at the time was 10 years old, standing with me, and I was directly behind her. Getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, Czechoslovakian woman is talking to Kathy. Hey, how you doing? This is a nice day today. They're just chatting up. And she says, yes, so Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with the roses because she's waiting for the pay. Of course, Kathy looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming from her eye. Mommy, you're not going to let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women. Right, I'm thinking, okay. So then I become the angry black woman. Right, and they're going to be. And I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, something you're going to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad checkbook. So this is the book that shows people who written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks. At which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all these changes? Why are you doing it? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, I can't believe what this checker's done with this woman, and it's totally unacceptable. At which point, the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law gives me a smile. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here's what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege, and even though Kathy didn't have black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made a mistake. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
And so with that video, even though it didn't directly comment on anti-racism training groups, we really felt like this represented the roles. We found it on Montana Racial Equity Project's website. We felt that this portrayed all of the roles that are experienced within daily life and what white people experience, and that anti-racism training equips people to use their white privilege in a positive influence. So even though her sister-in-law was half black, half white, most of the time people assume that she is white, so she was able to use that white privilege, and we felt like anti-racism training groups equips you for that. But also it explains for this woman that there are different roles, and it gives explanations to what she's experiencing and a rhetoric to talk about it. And that's something that anti-racism training groups can prepare people for both sides of the spectrum on how to properly or most efficiently handle these very difficult situations that occur daily in our lives. And then from here on out, we'll be talking about various anti-racism training groups.
So one of the anti-racist training groups that is, practices cracking the codes of white supremacy is the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, and they're undoing racism. They're based on 6 premises, and they're a multicultural, anti-racist community organizers and educators with national and international outreach. They have over 50 trainers today and have impacted over 500,000 individuals nationally and internationally. So the first premise that they deal with is says that racism is not about individual deficiencies, but is a social construction biased in favor of people who have over generations come to be called white. The second one is the foundation of American society is rooted in a belief in the perceived superiority of white people. The third one is addressing diversity without seeking to address the power imbalance resulting from racism perpetuates systemic inequities in education, social services, healthcare, legal institutions, and all other systems. Number 4, the historical foundations of our race-constructed society is unknown by many, therefore stereotypes and misperceptions about race are ingrained in the American culture and exported internationally. Number 5, African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color, though oppressed by racism, may assimilate the perceptions of the dominant society in demeaning those with less money, education, and social standing, including other people of color. Number 6 says that racial oppression is one of the root causes of poverty in this country. So what they do is they hold these workshops that focus on understanding what racism is and where it comes from and how it functions. And these workshops, you go through different scenarios, and you hold these dialogues that aren't comfortable, but and aren't really something that every person who's going there is going to have. Not everyone who's going there is going to have these in their daily life every single day. So it gets people used to having these dialogues that are uncomfortable. It was founded in 1980 by Ronald Chisholm, who was a community organizer of New Orleans, and James Norman Dunn, who was a professor at Antioch College. And they founded the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to develop analytical, cultural-rooted, and effective anti-racist community organizers. And there's Ronald Chisholm and Dr. Jim Dunn. So the workshop has a lot of principles, and the first one is undoing racism, and it said that undoing racism is the single most critical barrier to building effective coalitions for social change. So when they're talking about undoing racism, that's what they're trying to get rid of that barrier, so they can make those changes. Number 2 is learning from history, and saying that history is a tool for effective organizing, and understanding the lessons that history can give us creates a more humane future. Sharing culture, if a community's culture is respected and nurtured, the community's power will grow. Developing leadership. Anti-racist leadership needs to be developed intentionally and systemically with local communities. Maintaining accountability. To organize with integrity requires that we be accountable to the communities struggling with racist oppression. Networking, and this is one of the interesting ones, as the movement develops a strong network, people are less likely to fall through. So keeping those connections and trying to grow the group so they can help each other, so we can help each other, get on each other, if one of us is slacking today. Analyzing power. Through the analysis of institutional power, we can identify and unpack the systems external to the community that create the internal realities that many people experience daily. Gatekeeping. People who work in institutions often function as gatekeepers. So it's touching the people who work within these institutions that may have some sort of have racist elements within, and having the gatekeepers, as what they call them in here, being a part of that dialogue. So they become an agent of institutional transformation. And then undoing internalized racial oppression. And it says that internalized racial oppression manifests itself in two ways. One is internalized racial inferiority, and that's the acceptance of and acting out of an inferior definition of self given by the oppressor, and it's rooted in historical designation of one's race over many generations. And then there's internalized racial superiority, which is the acceptance of and acting out of a superior definition that is rooted in the historical designation of one's race. And then identifying and analyzing those manifestations of racism. So the Undoing Racism Community Workshop is their signature workshop that they conduct, and it challenges participants to analyze the structures of power and privileges that hinder social equity. So it's through the dialogue and the role-playing, strategic planning and presentations. And they said that participants will develop a common definition of racism and understanding of its different forms, so individual, institutional, linguistic, and cultural. The cost is a community organizing strategy team, and it's to seek long-term technical assistance from the People's Institute as they develop anti-racist community organizing strategies. Works with community activists to analyze their organizations, their roles, their relationships with one another across racial and cultural lines. RAE, Reflection Assessment Evaluation Team. It's an assessment process that helps organizations or a group state observe and measure its vision and values. There's a commitment to its objective goals and outcomes. And European Dissent was founded in 1989 as a collective of white anti-racist organizers. And they're all persons of European descent who dissent from the racist institutions and values designed to benefit them. The People's Institute Youth Agenda, they identify and mentor young anti-racist organizers in colleges and in the neighborhoods where the People's Institute does its work. And they put together freedom schools in New Orleans, Seattle, Duluth, Minneapolis, Oakland, and other locations to talk about race and racism and equality with younger people. And then the Jim Dunn Center for Anti-Racist Community Organizing, which Jim Dunn was one of the co-founders. He passed away, but it's like a leadership school for anti-racist grassroots organizers. They all get together there and talk about different ideas, share their experiences and their stories, and they can plan together. And this is one of the Undoing Racism workshops that Ronald Chisholm was able to talk about, and people who talk about what it was like to attend the workshop.
Yeah, and just to punctuate, this video does a really good job of incorporating that idea of training groups going in and educating the individuals in order to address the institutional problems of racism. And so, like we had mentioned at the beginning, what happens. Ronald Chisholm talks about what it does institutionally, but there's also personal accounts within of how people were transformed by training and by education in order to better address racism institutionally.
Well, the thing that is people who are doing any kind of organizing social change must acknowledge one of the principles that becomes a major barrier is not understanding how internalized racial oppression plays out in communities of color as well as in the white movement. Because we think we got to have a multiracial movement, which includes everybody. But one of the barriers is not understanding how those manifestations of inferiority and superiority playing out can set us back. And that's a major issue nationally in every group around the country, not only in my region. That internalized racial oppression, which is generational, going on for years, it keeps hitting us in the head every time we get to make move forward. Not understanding that it set us back. I think we made progress with it, getting more acknowledgement of it, but it's a real issue that's going to be a major barrier or an obstacle or slowing our progress up. We don't recognize that's a major thing.
We discovered, not to anyone's surprise, that disproportionality with respect to African Americans exists in all the major institutions that we have in our government, in our society. That includes housing, education, recreational, criminal justice, health, you name it. African Americans and other families of color suffer the worst outcomes and the highest levels of disproportionality.
So learning about the principles out of the Undoing Racism workshop really highlighted for me how racism is embedded in institutions that affect our families and children. And that even though one may think one is a good person and does good things, that you cannot help but have to work past the implicit bias and racism that exists in institutions, and that decisions sometimes are made and people may not be aware of how they're affecting children. Those come from institutions, and that our responsibility as child advocates is to change that, to really change how we look at each child and work past that institutionalized racism.
I think I was born to be in this movement. As a child, I remember standing around after church and being just playing, but being so ready to go home. My parents were sitting and talking, and they would stay out there for hours. And what I didn't know that I know now was they were talking and organizing. So all my life I've been exposed to organizing, but didn't realize it. And even with our family conversations at the dinner table, it was around racial issues and dealing with things in life and how to navigate through life.
We're doing Undoing Racism workshops all across this country. And as those workshops are done by the People's Institute, we see more and more people who go through that training actually bringing other people to this work. And so we know that it's all about being grounded in those principles, that they are the foundation for our work, and that it leads to the kind of organizing that will allow us to realize our vision. And again, our vision is that the problems that we are faced with today in every system and institution that produces disproportionate and disparate outcomes for the same population of people, that we will recognize and commit to the transformation of systems so that those outcomes no longer exist for African Americans and other people of color.
So not only working with the workshops and individuals, they also work with large-scale programs. So in 2005, Casey Family Programs, the largest private foster care system in the nation, partnered with the People's Institute to train hundreds of workers who are involved in private child protective service agencies around the U.S. And since working with all these different, I guess, programs and groups, they've grown a lot. They have an office in Minnesota and Washington. They have a Northeast office that was established in 2004, and also a Southeast office that was established in 2006.
So the People's Institute, like my co-presenter said, is really far-reaching, and so I also wanted to, give some attention to another organization that also really does a good job of connecting the individual experience with greater systemic issues and institutionalized racism, which is called Roots of Justice. And also, Roots of Justice has a faith-based component to it too, which I thought kind of gave it a little bit of a different perspective from the People's Institute. So the vision that they stated on their website, I should put quotes, but I took this right off the website, is Roots of Justice envisions a world where we work for justice in love enables all to live authentic and fulfilled lives. And the mission is Roots of Justice seeks the liberation of all persons from oppression by providing strategies and tools for educating, organizing, and renewing persons, institutions, and systems. What led us to Roots of Justice was learning about the Damascus Road anti-racism process, and we actually have an expert in the room. It was started by Tobin Shear and Regina Stoltzfus. I hope I'm not butchering that name. And so my understanding is that Roots of Justice was established in order to support the work of Damascus Road and the Mennonite Central Committee. And this training program was designed, they really talk about designing to prepare groups and institutions to dismantle racism. So they talk about pulling groups together to go through this process together and get the tools to dismantle racism, as opposed to some groups that I'm going to talk about in a minute, which allow individuals in, and not that Damascus Road doesn't, but my understanding is that the encouragement was really for groups to come in. So I wanted to show you guys this video because I thought it really did a good job of showing the process of Damascus Road and the steps for participants.
The Damascus Road anti-racism process is a multi-stage process designed to equip individuals and institutional change teams to make a difference in their communities and organizations. The first 2.5-day workshop, the analysis training, provides participants with a common language to talk about racism, an analysis of systemic racism and how it affects white people and people of color, a basic understanding of the institution, how they function, and how they can change, and hope.
For the first time in my life, I actually had words for my experience. When I'm trying to talk about systemic racism, I now have a language to do so. That was very empowering for me.
The analysis training that we received from Damascus Road really opened, given us tools to have conversation. The other training has been like in the year following it, as I myself really noticing things and noticing to myself that I'm looking forward to seeing.
Following the analysis training, participants are encouraged to attend a caucusing retreat, where people of color or white people gather to more deeply understand how they internalize the message of racism. This work within racial groups allows for stronger intercultural relationships in the future. In the Damascus Road organizing training, another 2.5-day workshop, institutional change teams learn organizing skills and strategize for change.
The education advisory training provides people who are committed to our institutions with skills, tools, a way of thinking, and a way of analyzing the institution and collectively do the work of dismantling racism and also do the work of building healthier organizations.
The organizing has dedicated strategies for how the group is trying to do education around this, trying to be advocates around racism in the community, trying to bring forward education. We were able to lead the training specific tasks that each of us were carrying out. And as a result of it, we have actually seen progress, things take place that actually were a direct result of going to the Damascus Road training. We would not have accomplished any of that that makes us tools to be able to articulate what we want to do, what we want to accomplish, and how we want to do it.
So what I thought was really cool about Damascus Road is that there's an emphasis on organizing in addition to like knowledge and awareness of biases. And then as you heard from the video, like there are very specific things that you take away from it. I thought that in my experience with anti-racism training, that is like a unique approach. So the next two I'm going to talk about, the next two organizations are local to us, and I thought it was important to talk a little bit about what's local and how we can use those resources. So the first is the Montana Racial Equity Project out of Bozeman. And the vision for the Montana Racial Equity Project is earnest dialogue and active listening are key to challenging our assumptions and understanding those who are different from ourselves. We have learned that once a discussion on race begins, participants open up to consider the intersectionality of all our differences, whether grounded in gender, sexual orientation, or expression, religion, income, and education levels. To that end, the Montana Racial Equity Project strives to achieve equity, racial justice, and positive transformational change for Montana's historically marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed peoples in the personal, social, systemic, and structural arenas. So the Montana Racial Equity Project was started by Judith Howman, and she's the founder and executive director, and it's a pretty new organization. They started in 2014, but Judith brings with her like a whole wealth of knowledge. She's done a bunch of different work in the social justice arena. She's worked for Obama campaign, she worked for Gun Save America, she's done a lot of really interesting work, and she actually just got the 2018 Civil Liberties Award that's handed out by the ACLU each year. And something that I think is interesting about the Montana Racial Equity Project as we look at these different groups and what their focus is it a primarily anti-racist focus? Is it an intersectional focus? Is there crossover? As you can see from their vision statement that I just read, there is a primary focus on race, and Judith talks about this when she speaks, that even though she does look at things from an intersectional perspective, she focuses on race primarily and then looks at other issues as well. So anti-racism training, as my co-presenter started by saying, can really take a lot of different shapes. And so the Montana Racial Equity Project does what we think of as traditional anti-racism training. Like, it looks like a classroom setting where you register and you go in and you learn about these things. So they do a lot of work like that, but they also train in other ways. So they do different community events that teach people about different aspects. They do like classroom dialogues, like they go into schools, they go into workplaces, and they consult with other organizations. Something also that I wanted to bring your attention to is on the website, they talk about teaching and advocating aspiring allyship, and that really resonated with me, the idea that like you're always aspiring to be an ally. It's not like this certification that you get and you can check the box, like it's constantly work to do, and I thought that that was a really cool way of talking about it. And I also think it's important to think about that like this work is not done in isolation, and so some of the partners that these organizations work with can be really far-reaching. So we see things like the ACLU and the Montana Human Rights Network, which we would expect to see, but then there are also things like the library and like the Bozeman Tea House and things where their central mission is not racial justice, but they're still able to open up their like plan and work with other organizations. And I think it's really cool how Judith and the other people at the Montana Racial Equity Project have been able to build those partners. So the other local organization is Empower Montana, which is right here in Missoula, and their vision statement is a little different. So they say Empower Montana creates a more just and inclusive society by developing youth and adult leaders who work to end mistreatment, correct systemic inequalities, and strengthen communities across Montana. Empower Montana envisions a Montana where each person is respected, where differences are understood, where youth, institutions, and communities share a commitment to correct injustices, and where all people have the opportunity, to thrive without the risk of violence or oppression. And it really struck me the difference between the two mission statements, and it also aligned with my understanding of these organizations. And Empower Montana, even though they do have a lot of anti-racism training focus, they also focus on a lot of other issues as well, and it's a little more of a broad organization. So Empower Montana was actually started as a chapter of the National Coalition Building Institute, which is a really large organization. So when you hear people in town say NCBI, they're talking about Empower Montana. And just a few years ago, Empower Montana sort of grew out of that. They were wanting to do their own programming and take different approaches a little outside of what NCBI was doing. So they're now partners, but Empower Montana is something separate. So similar to what we saw with the Montana Racial Equity Project, Empower Montana approaches anti-racism training in a variety of ways. So they do that more traditional classroom setting. They also do after-school clubs, educator trainings. They go into workplaces, a lot of similar things that the Montana Racial Equity Project does. And they're also really involved in the MLK Day celebration, and that's a picture from not this past year, but the year before, of someone giving their speech as a winner of one of the children's programs. So another big thing to Empower Montana is they're really youth leadership focused, and that's sort of the lens in which they look at things. So one of the big things that they do, and I haven't gotten to go yet because I haven't been here for a year yet, but it'll be on April 12th this year, the Diversity Day celebration. So on April 12th, 2010, Missoula passed the non-discrimination ordinance that we have. And so Diversity Day is sort of a celebration of that, and it's also an opportunity for Empower Montana to give youth a stage for voices. So that is anti-racism training in that day, but it's looked at as a different way. So youth come and they give speeches, they sing, they dance, they perform art and things of that nature. And so Empower Montana is really focused on that youth advocacy piece and youth leadership, and that sort of weaves in with the anti-racism work that they do. And I also noticed on their website that they're taking nominations for performers, if anybody knows anyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about impact. I think that as we know in this kind of work, impact is kind of hard to measure. This came out of the what did they call it? I apologize. It was their annual report from 2016 to 2017, and you can see that they talk about these different areas, like in Bozeman, 50 people empowered. They didn't go into detail in terms of like where did they get that number. I would assume that that means like the people that interacted with their programs, but I don't have background on exactly what those numbers mean. But it felt like a strong number. Like if you look at Missoula County, 4,340 people, that feels like it's really far-reaching.
So to kind of wrap up, hopefully you guys have kind of been thinking and digesting. A lot of this class is discussion based. So just
Oh, I apologize. I messed up. So I also just, before we get in the discussion, I wanted to pass these out. It's sort of a follow-up to the local organizations. So on the front, you'll see that there are 2 anti-racism training groups coming up. And I'm actually going to the one in Bozeman if anyone wants to carpool. And also kind of thinking about, like, we all lead busy lives. How do we support these organizations? So some ideas of how you can do that in 5 minutes or less. And also just an acknowledgement that there are so many anti-racism training organizations, and we could have talked about them all day. And so I listed a few other ones, and just an acknowledgement, like this is not at all collective of all anti-racism training. And then this is also a brochure for the Montana Racial Equity Project, only one that we passed around. Oh, okay, great. And then also that the last thing in the packet is a blog for the Montana Racial Equity Project. It's sort of like anti-racism training written in the form of a blog, and so to kind of give you a taste of what that could look like. We can do our discussion.
Okay. Sorry. And these are guideline questions that we have, but feel free to take it kind of in any direction that you want. But one that we talked in length about is the second question here. How do we make anti-racism training more prevalent? Because a lot of us talked about a lot of the people going to anti-racism training groups and programs are often people that are already recognizing racism as an issue. So not to discount that, not to assume that people who admit that racism is a thing don't need language or training or anything like that. But should there be some kind of push to either have government or private industry incorporate anti-racism training within different programs? So we talked about how at Walmart you have to go through a program in order how to learn not to cut yourself with a box cutter or different safety protocol. So would anti-racism training be acceptable in that field, and what would that look like? And do you guys think that would be a realistic thing?
Did any of you guys read about how United is making their, I don't know if it's all their employees do anti-racism training, but some of their employees, to kind of give you an idea of what that could potentially look like.
I think it could be useful in schools, for sure. I think there might be a lot of pushback from like parents who think that it's not an appropriate topic to be discussing in school, but if you're going to be talking about American history, like we cover the civil rights movement in elementary school, and the way that we do that can kind of be fraught. And if we have anti-racism trainings for children, which it seems like a lot of these organizations have programs specifically geared towards youth, and that's a really, really great place to start, because if you're already thinking about that stuff from the time that you're very young, then it'll grow and evolve with you as you get older.
I think there's also probably, it'd be a good idea to have like school teachers and professors do anti-racism training. They do that already? Like, I'd be surprised if they didn't, to be honest.
There's no requirement for university.
Huh.
The discussion we
That
had,
seems weird.
yeah, the discussion we had as a group was that it's not that, we're not saying that this doesn't exist in some spaces, but it just doesn't seem like it's prevalent enough. And so not to say that there aren't, maybe there's a school somewhere that does require that, but that it's not, like, how do we make it a norm? Or should it be a norm, I guess, is another part of the question.
Yeah, I think it should be a norm. Because like teachers are the ones that are distributing like critical information to young children and like teenagers, and they're also interacting with people from many different backgrounds. So like making sure that they do that in an equitable way is essential.
I think it'd also be important to have this kind of training for like managers of stores, like especially at least starting with that, as opposed to immediately going like every single employee of this company has to have like, you know, anti-racism training, because that would be awesome if every single person. I just don't know how realistic it is, especially because in the instance of like sexual harassment stuff, like there's nothing like that, and the only time that that kind of training comes up is in the instance of sexual harassment. And so I think it's, I think you kind of have to start with like the higher ups and then have it kind of, like it'd just be a place to start.
I think that there's definitely a way though to implement these kind of trainings with, I guess, like maybe lower level positions in places like retail spaces or like even fast food like you guys were just talking about, because like it's required, as far as I know, like it's required to talk about workers' rights as well. And I think that, you know, just like you can't be discriminated against by your employer, it's illegal. And I think there's definitely a big tie-in with, hey, if you notice this in your workplace, especially, like it's not okay. And then from there, I think there's definitely a conversation to be had about like what should you do when you notice like somebody who's in your place of business is experiencing something horrible. And that's extra important because there's a lot of them, even like I just noticed in this packet, it talks about it, like what do you do if you see somebody being berated for who they are in like a supermarket? And that's really important. I think it has so much impact because it's a lot of like, there's a lot of microaggressions too that we have to deal with when we talk about racial discrimination especially. So I think there definitely is a way to implement it in that way, even though definitely the system is flawed and a lot of this stuff doesn't happen until there's been an instance of it.
I don't mean to be going off on like tangents here, but when you guys were showing like the videos where like they had the participators of the training, one of the things I noticed that there weren't any white males who spoke, and because they benefit the most from our current systems in place, I was actually like really curious as to what they had to say about being trained in anti-racism. Did you guys like come across any videos while you guys were searching for videos or anything?
I had not, which I feel like kind of dovetails well into this third question of should anti-racism training groups be targeting more obvious areas of white supremacy as well? So targeting more of a white male audience, or even trying to garner some attention, while it might seem difficult to do, attention from radical groups and radical white supremacy groups. But I really think that's an astute observation. I don't know if my...
I'm gonna answer just, so not the videos, but with, People's Institute of European Descent, that's a group of primarily white people, European descent, that have power and that privilege. So they're having a lot of that conversation. Yeah.
But I do think you bring up a very valid question. How do we address this? How do we address the groups that are benefiting the most from the system?
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say is I was thinking about that a little bit with the videos and wondering if that was intentional on the part of the people that are creating the videos, in terms of acknowledging that this shouldn't be about white men, but that white men need to be like, step up and sit back kind of idea. And so I'm curious about that too, and I don't know if that was intentional, but I do think it's fair to say, in all of the spaces I've been, in these kind of discussions, like, white men are usually the minority, and so I think that that is, and it kind of falls into what you're saying, and how do we get the people that really need to be there.
Okay.
Not that we all don't need it, but I was sort of curious if that was intentional or not, and I don't know if you were a part of the Damascus Road video, and if you could share with us if that was intentional, but.
I was no longer with the organization by the point that particular video was developed. I think in some of our earlier materials, we did very deliberately feature white men because we thought it was so important to have those voices testifying to what the difference it made and the concrete actions that have come out of it. So, yeah, good observation.
I asked that because I was asking Zyra, I asked Zyra earlier about like the demographics for the tunnel of repression. That was one of my questions.
You were very polite and positive about all the groups you described. Can you be critical about what you see? Obviously, you were just going on what you researched, but can you do a little bit of critical analysis of these groups in addition to just saying they're great?
Yeah. So something I can say that, and this comes from my personal experience interacting with Judith from the Montana Racial Equity Project, and I know some other people in this room have seen her speak too, that I think it's sort of an underlying thing that we've been discussing in this class, that the way she talks is not always for everyone, and that she is not afraid to call people out. She's not afraid to make you really question yourself. She's not worried about triggering white fragility, and I think that there's a lot of benefit to that. However, I also think that I worry that there could be spaces where that happens, where people aren't ready for it, and then they dismiss everything she has to say. And so I also know that she's very skilled, and I would imagine that she's good at talking to different people in different situations, but the context in which I've seen her, I could imagine some of my white peers who maybe don't think about this stuff quite as much, kind of just shutting her off. And so I think that's a critique, and not just specifically for her, in general, of how do we balance meeting people where they are, but also being willing to call out stuff when we see it.
Yeah, and for me, in terms of thinking about Empower Montana groups that are not focused on one thing, sometimes that can be a disadvantage. So they're not entirely focused on dismantling racism, while it is a component of their mission statement. Sometimes that can cause fractures within the group, and it prevents bringing forth a united front and really being able to tackle racism head on, because you can have conflicts with other groups as well. And you see that throughout history, different civil movements competing with one another for attention and for either funding or people or support or anything like that. And so with Empower Montana, the bigger you get in terms of what you're trying to change can cause an issue and be problematic.
I worked with a anti-racist organization in Pittsburgh called What's Up Pittsburgh, and I did a study group with them that was about, I think it was 3 months, and it was just for white people. And I think that one of my big criticisms with it is that it's so easy to do that and think about those things and not act. And so just use it as this way to reflect and think about it and get stuck in shame and not. And I think there was something really productive about doing it in a group, and it was really good, but like without making sure that there's praxis involved, it's so easy to just kind of protect yourself and be like, well, I never want to mess up, so I'm just gonna, you know, keep learning and avoiding doing things.
Yeah, that risk of making it an individual instead of using your information.
Yeah, and saying like the reason why we want to get this information is so we can take action and collective action, not so that we can just kind of have a better understanding.
Yeah, and like there's that knowledge part and the action part. So when it's with workshops, you have the workshops and you do all these scenarios. Is there any way to tell like who's actually doing what afterwards? And is that okay to like, register like who's doing what? Are you keeping up with your work?
Yeah, that really resonates with me, and I think that's one of the reasons why I was excited about the Damascus Road video, is that I felt like it highlighted how the program encourages, like, this isn't just work that we do in this one space. I don't know if Tobin, you can speak more to that, but.
That's very much the organizing model that Damascus Road uses. It talks about the necessity of anti-racism, educating and organizing. And one thing I used to say all the time is that those are the 2 feet that any effective anti-racism project walk on. The need for education and the need for applying that. And it's really not going to do you much good if you don't have one or the other.
So we've talked about a lot of groups that have like religious framing. How do you think that group that's faith-based, what do you think the efficacy of that group is? Do you think that it meets them at a similar frame, or what do you guys think about that?
Should I answer? So I had, and that was the, so Damascus Road is, Roots of Justice, like, was created to sort of support Damascus Road. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's the other way around. Roots of Justice emerged after Damascus Road left the sponsoring organization. Excuse me. Damascus Road was first. Roots of Justice came later.
Oh, okay. And I think that something I was thinking about is that their website doesn't really talk about faith. Like, the only way it does, like, when you go into some of the, like, the newsletters and stuff and blogs, there was a little bit, but it wasn't really, like, I didn't notice it until I started looking more. And I actually am working with a faith-based organization right now that is doing community organizing, and it's not anti-racism focused, but I thought a lot about your question, like, what is the efficacy, and are we isolating people? And I guess in my experience, I would say that there is going to be some isolation of people. Some people are going to say, like, if something has a religious affiliation, like, no, that's not a line that I cross. However, I think the work that I've been doing this year really has kind of changed my lens about that, and that I think that there is a lot of efficacy in that work as long as it's done in a way that's really inclusive to everybody. So it's not like this church does this and only people who pay their dues get to be a part of it. So I guess the answer to my question would be that it depends on the way that faith is infused. I don't know what you think.
Also, I would have to say, I think it's important to realize the role that religion has played in racism. And I really think that with these faith-based organizations, it is really important to confront that and to recognize the role that especially Christianity in the United States has played. And I think it's really important for Christians to realize that as well. While they may not subscribe to that and, put up that kind of defense of white fragility where, like, I'm not a racist, like, I'm a Christian, and so I think having faith-based training groups helps to combat that and to kind of combat that pushing off onto other groups or to like crazy Christian radicals. So I think that there is, if done properly, a huge benefit, and we have to admit the fact that Christianity is the majority religion within the United States, a lot of people. So I feel like there will be isolation, and there's always, things that will cause conflict or isolate, but I also think that using faith-based can also be extremely beneficial as well. So, also. These are our references since we want to make sure they're up there. But are there any other last-minute questions before we wrap up?
Did you guys find any anti-racist training groups that were specifically geared towards people who maybe hadn't thought of racism before, instead of just focusing on people who are open to that idea?
I want to say yes, but I guess I feel like then I'm speaking for the organization, and since I'm not a part of these organizations, I'm not totally confident in that answer. But so, for example, the way that Montana, Empower Montana approaches it is you get separated into however you identify, either as an ally or a person of color, and that's supposed to be a little more inclusive and helpful, both for white people that are figuring out their white fragility and wanting to be in a space where that's safe, and for people of color, so they don't have to deal with that, right? And so I think the way that they've set it up is supposed to be more inclusive for people that are at all areas of the spectrum on this work. But since I'm not a part of that organization, I don't know if they would wholeheartedly agree with me, but I feel like that's definitely something I saw from them. And when I was doing some Googling, there were definitely different routes. And also, these organizations, it's not like every time Judith talks from Montana Racial Equity Project, she says the same thing every time, right? So she's going to alter it depending on who her audience is, and I think that's a part of it too. And I know that that's a big reason why she's working to get these different partners and to go into workplaces to kind of insert these ideas where they might not have been asked for.
And I think some of these trainings are to get people to go and confront people who aren't necessarily interested.
That's a good point.
So that's, the workshops may not directly correlate to people who, don't care if they're a thing or not, but the people who attend the workshops, that's the hope, is that they'll go out into the world and practice these things.
Okay. Round of applause for our presenters.